We have prayer, ma'am.
Okay.
We have prayer and welcome address. Then you can start.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
A very pleasant evening to one and all gathered here. Children's literature speaks the language of the imagination, and the study of this literature is used to train and improve that imagination. On behalf of the PG and Research Department of English, I feel immense pleasure by inviting you all to the webinar on fantasy in children's literature. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Now, I kindly request Miss Aileen Risha, Assistant Professor, Department of English, to invoke God's blessings.
Father in heaven, we come before you this evening. We praise and thank you for giving us good health and spirit. Let us always rejoice in you with a grateful heart. Dear Lord, fill us with your strength and enrich us with your love. We place the resource person, the participants, and the organizers in your hands. Help us not to lean on our own understanding, but in everything acknowledge you so that you can direct our words, thoughts, and actions. Let this session be a blessing to each one of us. May your name be glorified in all that we do. Hear our prayers as the Bible says, the Lord will answer us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, ma'am, for bringing the presence of God amidst us. Yesterday is gone, tomorrow is a mystery, and today is a blessing. Now I invite Ms. Shamin Onita, Assistant Professor, Department of English, to deliver the welcome address.
From the rising of the sun unto the going down of the same, the Lord's name is to be praised. Psalms 113, verse 3. A pleasant evening to everyone. On behalf of PG and Research Department of English, Shift 1 and 2, Holy Cross all to this webinar on fantasy in children's literature. I extend a cordial welcome to our Secretary, Reverend Sister Dr. Niranjana Andonisamy, and our dynamic Principal, Reverend Sister Dr. Christina Bridget, who has always been a pillar of support in all our endeavors. I take joy in welcoming Reverend Sister Dr. Judy Gomes, Vice Principal and Head of the Department of English, who always stands as a fervent supporter and motivator to enlighten the young minds. With zest and honor, I welcome our resource person, Ms. Elizabeth Thomas, Associate Professor of English, Ethiraj College for Women, Chennai. She has 20 years of teaching experience. Teaching and writing are two important aspects that she enjoys greatly. Her areas of interest in literature are African American literature, popular literature, children's literature, creative writing, and poetry. While exploring many literatures, the one that is very close to her is children's literature. Hearty welcome to you, ma'am. I render a genial welcome to the teachers of the Department of English of both Shift 1 and 2 for constant support and guidance. I also extend my word of welcome to the students of the Department of English, both Shift 1 and 2, for rendering their active participation. Once again, I welcome you all.
Thank you, ma'am, for your warm words of welcome. To be inspired is great, but to be an inspiration is an honor. Now, I call upon our chief guest, Miss Elizabeth Thomas, Associate Professor, Department of English, Hethraj College for Women, Chennai, to inspire us with a valuable speech.
Thank you. And good evening to one and all present. My sincere thanks to the principal, the management, the head of the Department of English, and all the staff of English Department for inviting me to be a resource person in children's literature. Children's literature is very close as ma'am said, rightly pointed out. And this is a field that, I enjoy teaching. This is part of our syllabus, and it's I'm just trying to, sorry. Okay. It's part of our syllabus, and apart from just being part of a syllabus, it's something that I enjoy a lot. So it is a joy to, talk about children's literature as such. And my topic today will be on, can you see my presentation? Should I make it a little bigger? Is this okay?
Ma'am, could you make it a little bigger, ma'am?
Yeah,
Bigger,
sure.
ma'am.
Sure.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, okay. All right. So this is a fascinating field, and a field that has recently come into, more, shall we say, research and more interest. It has become an area of interest for a lot of people. And children's literature is something that, transcends age boundaries, transcends adulthood or childhood, right? And it is something that fascinates both children and adults. And as rightly pointed out, I am a person who loves poetry. And of course, I would like to invite you to my speech with a poem. This is written by Shel Silverstein, again, children's literature, writer of children's literature, and he's a well-known poet. So the invitation is, if you are a dreamer, come in. If you're a dreamer, a wisher, a liar, a hoper, a prayer, a magic bean buyer, if you're a pretender, come sit by my fire. If you have some flax golden tales to spin, come in. Come in. This is the best place to talk about children's literature. And this is the best time to talk about children's literature, because that is the literature that focuses not just on the child, the joy of the child, but also teaches you so much in life and prepares you for something that is an adventure by itself, which is life, right? So what exactly is children's literature? I'm sure you've gone through all the definitions of children's literature, that is there. And these are things that I've just compiled for our reference. It is written basically for children, to be read by children, to be enjoyed by children. But it's so fascinating that the writers, who are adults mostly, also end up reading children's literature. People like me, all right, though we've been reading children's literature and working on children's literature for a long time. And this is something that includes books, stories, magazines, poems, anything that, fascinates a child. But modern children's literature is generally classified based on two criteria. One is the genre in which it is written, and the other is the intended age of the reader. What do we mean by the intended age of the reader? For example, if you have children from the age of 3 to 5 reading, we have books that have, pictures. All right, basically there'll be very little words and more of pictures. And genre, of course, it's poetry, prose, fiction, right? And the different ways in historical fiction, all right, or like we are going to talk about fantastical fiction, fantasy, right? And it is, but basically, why am I talking about modern children's literature, divided? Because when we look at children's literature or literature written basically for children, these are stories, these are oral traditions that have been carried from generation to generation by songs, by stories that our grandmothers told us or their grandmothers told them, right? And these are the stories that we are actually losing out today, because nobody tells us stories nowadays, right? All we have now is books that we have. And, if you are very interested in research or in doing some work, I would, really sincerely appreciate if somebody would pick up, publish stories that are forgotten, that are being forgotten, right? Our folklore is basically part of children's literature, and that will be really great if you could do it, right? So when we look at the early part, how children's literature grew, right? Before printing, it is difficult to say this is children's literature, or, we cannot identify it, because it's basically orature. right? Orature is oral literature that is passed from generation to generation. But of course, with printing, children's tales actually were created for adults, but were adapted for children, right? So that they could read, and usually you had a very moral or a religious message. So literature is basically where it is for education, erudition, and for entertainment, right? So there was moral or religious message that was specifically given for children. So, and that is when late 19th and early 20th centuries became known as the golden age of children's literature, because that's when a lot of classics were published, right? And that's when people started focusing or identifying, or actually, if you look at history, that was the time when children became part, or acknowledged as part of society. They were no longer considered to be the invisible, right? They were just there. It wasn't like that. Children started the society started paying more attention to children, and they started this form of literature. So what exactly do you find in children's literature? What do they talk about in children's literature? Well, when we look at modern children's literature, these are the themes that are usually discussed in children's literature: world issues that talk about what is happening, environment today especially. You have so many writers talking about the environmental issues. You have Greta Thunberg talking about environmental issues, a child, a 16-year-old who goes to UN, talks about. And these are the issues that the children's writers are talking about. It's not just issues, it's also about morals, all right? Books that talk about what is good, what is bad. How does a child understand what is good or what is bad, all right? How do you tell a story, all right? And what are the emotions? Should I cry when there are certain things happening, all right? Or, what sort of an emotion should I show? These are things that nowadays children don't know how to react. And these are things that they learn, they pick up, all right? For example, I have to react. If anything is, not right, I have to react, all right? That kind of idea is given through books nowadays, right? Yes, we are all in virtual books also, right? We read ebooks, right? And these books basically focus on relationships, the child and the adult. What is the role of a child in the family? How does a child look after the adult? And the adult's role in the child's life, right? How a child is able to, molded the way the society needs a good citizen, right? So the adult's responsibilities, how do you interact with people? How do you interact in a social setting? All these are discussed in, as themes in certain books, right? And you also have books that talk about events that happen, for example, historical children's literature. Right, you have books that are written on Black Americans, right? The African Americans, their slavery, the kind of, for example, Mildred Taylor. Right, there are so many writers who write about the slavery that existed. You have books that are published in India that talks about the various culture, like the Chola Adventure. Right, you have Chola, Harappan, and you have these historical background with a story connected to it. So the child learns history, all right? And it talks about the event, like the Chola king had trade relations, right, with the outside world. So, children's, these books connect what is, the events that actually created history, all right? So, and the books also revolve around humans, revolve around animals, all right, and also about objects. Like for Harry Potter, for example, right, it revolves around the 7 hallows, right, Deathly Hallows, right, and humans are there, all right. So these are the themes, and basically, what is the focus of the theme when the writer begins to write is that the child should feel interested in writing, in reading the book. All right, it provides a sort of a perspective to the child, all right, to understand what the problem is and how to solve things, to understand that life doesn't have to be, just a drudgery. Life can be exciting. Just by reading, you can travel to places, right? It enables the reader to understand what life is basically about, right? And going on to and children's literature has so many genres of children's literature, right? You have science fiction, right? You have genres like historical fiction. You have, and fantasy. Fantasy is the most important genre in children's literature. Why? Because I think the child can imagine more than the human adults can, right? And they willingly suspend their disbelief. If a fairy appears right in front of you, you will definitely believe. A child will definitely believe, whereas an adult might have 1,000 questions to ask. So fantasy is something that enamors a child. So it is. Usually the books that are written are basically about ideas that happen in real life, all right, or ideas that you think can be superimposed to another magical world. For example, what if my cat could talk to me? What stories would the cat tell? You would have just imagine, right? The supernatural, if animals started talking, right? So fantasy basically concentrates on what is imaginary, right? You imagine that which is not in the ordinary, right? And an author who can imagine outside of the reality becomes a superb writer for children's literature. So the foundation of any fantasy in children's literature begins with the magical or supernatural elements, right? And so you can see that it is, when we look at fantasy novels in children's literature, the world is completely different from what we know, right? Going through your syllabus, right? I picked up books from your syllabus so that I can talk about this, right? The world is completely different. It is not the real, not the world that we live in, right? And it is full of magical elements and characters. And that is what separates, fantasy fiction from science fiction, because in science fiction, it is the use of technology, right? You have traveling, for example, you have these spaceships and things like that. But here, it is just imagination that makes you travel, right? And it also includes talking animals, for example, Wind in the Willows, right? Every character in the book is an animal, and they all talk, and they all have adventures, and they all have fun. They have parties, right? So it is unimaginable for an adult, but for a child, of course they have parties. Of course they have tea parties, right? So it is something. So, and another thing that most children's books related to fantasy will have, two of these things are journeys and quests, right? Every literature, even what you call as classic literature, always has a journey involved. It could be a journey inside yourself to find out what you are, who you are, all right? Or it could be an adventure outside, a journey to find new worlds, all right, or to find a new city, all right? And quests are, some kind of an adventure where you get something, a treasure hunt sort of a thing, right? So, and the setting of the fantasy novels or fantasy books in children's literature basically is in two things, right? Like any other book, time and place, right? The place in children's literature is an imaginary world, or a different universe, right? That has so many fascinating things that evolve and produce so much of enjoyment for us. And time is any time or no time, right? What do you mean by that? If you've read most of the children's literature, or if you've read the stories, or if you've heard stories, right? Always we begin with once upon a time, right? We begin stories with once upon a time, there lived a prince, right? So that sets the stage for the story to begin. And the closing of the stage, they lived happily ever after. All right, that's fantastic way of closing. So it could be any time and it could be any place. So it is timeless, it is placeless. And we also use the words long, long ago, right? These are, so there is no time definition. There is no place definition. So what happens? We can travel, right? Time travel, we can travel wherever we wish to do because it is fantastical, right? And the ordinary laws of the universe do not, do not operate in the fantastical universe, in the universe of fantasy, all right? Because magic happens. It is the center of all the, all the story, right? The plot. And of course, there are going to be surprising twists. Of course, there are going to be developments of the story, right? But these are situations that are unrealistic, right? For our world, if you look at from the human world, from the everyday life that we have, it is very unrealistic, right? But it is possible in fantasy literature, right? There's action and action that follows specific, simple patterns. What do I mean by that? The child, the protagonist, always, always finds what he is looking for. All right, good always wins. All right, so these are simple, specific patterns that you can find in the plot, right? And the plot starts, right out. There's no introduction, there's no explanation, nothing. All right, and if you've read any of, Harry Potter, for example, right, it begins so, it catches the eye of the reader, right? And the conflicts are always, conflict is the terminology used, the literary term, right? It is always resolved. There is no, there is no open-ended thing, right? It's always resolved. So when we talk about fantasy, worlds that are created, there are, this you should know, right? There are two worlds that are usually found in the fantasy world. One has the realistic setting, all right, that are called primary worlds. For example, Harry Potter lives in the primary world in the beginning, all right, and then goes on to Hogwarts, right, which is a fantasy setting, a secondary world, right? So some of the novels that begin and end in a fantasy world, The Hobbit, right, Lord of the Rings, right, and things like that, and others start in the real world and move to the fantasy world, Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, another interesting book, right? A third type of fantasy that has magical elements here and there is Mary Poppins, one of the most famous books, right? I would suggest that you read all these books. Now, I focused on your syllabus, as I told you, right? So I would be dealing with what is prescribed, all right? An interesting assortment of, wonderful literature that is prescribed for you, right? Hans Christian Andersen is the person that we begin children's literature with, and his tales are so well appreciated even today, right? Why? Because it is open to imagination, all right? It is something that is beyond our experience, right? And they are tales, they are wonder tales. They make you wonder, can that happen? All right, that question, that kind of question. And it also focuses on the human condition. For example, vanity and snobbery. That's what you read when you do your Emperor's New Clothes, right? How the emperor gets rid of his vanity and how beautifully it is done. And sacrifice, self-sacrificing is reflected in The Little Mermaid, one of the best stories that Hans Andersen has actually compiled. And you have this beautiful statue that is built for this Little Mermaid, right? And parables of death and deeply, it's not just stories that, that just talk about goodness of life. There are stories that are very philosophical. There are stories that talk about death, right? And talk about dreams that, push a person to become great, right? Yes, this is the life. These are life-inspiring stories. These are stories that will transform the way you look at life and the way that you want to, become a successful person. For example, the little match girl that is prescribed for you, right? And most of the stories that Anderson writes has a little bit of humor, peppered. He peppers the entire story with humor, but of course, you can see that there is a lot of somberness to the story that he writes, all right? And it's called dark fantasy, almost like Edgar Allan Poe writes, the dark romantic, right? So it is dark fantasy. And Hans Andersen is a person who is, who's captured the interest of children and writers and storytellers. I mean, you can take any story of Andersen and beautifully retell the story in, bringing the situation to your own city, right? So why? Because most of the themes in Andersen's stories is hope over adversity, right? There is always hope present. It doesn't matter how difficult life is, right? There is something that you can be hopeful for. And that is the life lesson that we should actually get from Andersen, especially in these times that we go through today, right? And there is beauty and goodness in this world, right? We become, when certain things happen around us, when, things become very difficult, we think life is so difficult, right? But no, life, there is beauty, there is goodness, if you're prepared to look for it. And how do you find it? There will be times when you have to give up certain things, self-sacrifice, right? You have to give up. For example, when you read the story Beauty and the Beast, Beauty is willing to give up, right? Willing to give up her uncertainties, willing to accept Beast as he is, right? And that self-sacrifice, she's willing to take up his, his place. And that's the meaning of life, right? You have the biggest meaning given in the Bible, for example, right? So the use of humor, the use of pathos, all right, to refocus on what really life is, all right, is what is used in fantasy, all right? Hans Andersen uses fantasy in such a way that the mind of the audience can relate it to the reality that they are facing, right? Now, I'm sorry if I'm rushing, please do forgive me, right? The other fascinating book that I found in your syllabus was Alice in Wonderland. An amazing book of Lewis Carroll, right? A person who perhaps revolutionized the way that one would think, right? It is a fantastic piece of fantasy literature, right? Because Alice, as you know, falls into a rabbit hole and enters Wonderland. Now, how many of us always wish to go off to some other land, right? And she realizes, starts realizing how different the world is, how the nature of the world is so different from where she comes from, that is the human world. And she has to constantly navigate to understand what this world means and how to go about this world, right? The reality that surrounds her is so different, and she has to, strategize every minute in order to shift or go through what is Wonderland, right? Now, that is something that is very relatable to our lives. Every things are so different. We have to navigate, right? And the boundaries that we face, or the boundaries that we set for ourselves, how do we maintain the distance? How do we constantly stay within our boundaries, all right? So this novel, for example, talks about how the boundaries between animal and human are constantly violated, and she cannot understand certain things that happen there, all right? And she finds it very interesting, and also, something that she has to relearn what she has already learned, right? And Carol brings in the nature of Wonderland as a lawless nature, right? And everything seems to, there are inversions that are there, right? Everything seems to be different, right? Like, for example, if you want to walk up to a place, right, you have to walk away from it, right? That is something that we don't normally do. We say we have to keep climbing the ladder of success, right? But here you have to come down in order to achieve what you want, right? And where in the world, in the natural world, in our world, would you see a rabbit in a waistcoat, right? That is something that is unimaginable, but it is imaginable in the fantastical literature of Lewis Carroll, right? So there is a continuous violations of inversions of the boundaries between human and animal world, right? But what is so interesting about this particular novel is the fact that Alice doesn't just disappear from the world, that the wonder world, like the Wizard of Oz, right, where the child just comes back to the land, right? But here she emerges, right? She Wonderland withdraws from her, right? So she starts reasserting. She asserts what the world, the normal world, thinks about and the way of thinking. And, you know, she almost creates chaos in the fantasy world. They cannot understand why this is so, right? And Alice, therefore, as Racklin says, rejects mad sanity in favor of sane madness of ordinary existence, right? It's better to be normal human being than to go into a wonder world that I cannot understand, right? So in following her adventures, right, we too start thinking about the concept of language, the concept of time, the space, right? If you remember the way the language is written, right? The language of Lewis Carroll is, you should remember, he's a mathematician, right? So his language also is jigsaw, right? It's beautiful to read, and it takes some time to understand, right? So the concept of space and time, and how she becomes small, how she becomes big, right? How time changes, right, is something that creates this kind of fantasy in Alice in Wonderland. And the principle of recovery that Tolkien always employs in his work is also found in Alice in Wonderland. That is, you can take a fantastic viewpoint, and that can add or give us the perspective of life, a better perspective of life, right? It is fantastical. You can read it, but then you can apply the same thing into our lives. What we recover, right, in fantasy is something that we can use in the real world. Therefore, what happens? We don't build boundaries, like Robert Frost says. Good fences make good neighbors, right? But here we know what is right and what is wrong, so we can limit ourselves and understand what life is all about. Rushing, I'm going on to the next novel that is there. One of my favorite writers, R.K. Narayan, right? A person who, who created Malgudi for us, right? A person who, with his language that is so fluent, that is so simple, created a world into which we could all, recognize. Because when we think of Lewis Carroll, when we think of Harry Potter, these are things that we cannot actually understand. But Swami and friends are, it could be us, it could be our neighbors, right? And where was Malgudi born? It was born in the master, the storyteller's imagination. It is a phenomenon in Indian literature, in Indian children's literature, that he created a place that is so beautiful, right? But that is like that is so simple and so, shall we say, approachable. We can understand the particular scene, like we can understand Swami and his friends and what they do in class, and how he does not want to do his homework, and how he does not want to study for his exams, and how his father insists that he studies, right? So these are things that we understand so well, and that came from this, the imagination, the beautiful imagination of R.K. Narayan, right? And what Malgudi is, according to R.K. Narayan himself, he says, Malgudi is where we all belong and where we wish we lived, all right? And that is something that you will relish when you read this novel, right? It is a fantasy place. It is a world of fantasy that is created by the way Narayan, narrates the story. All right, and there is fun, there is play, there is imagination. The child can imagine, all right, going and playing cricket, right? That is unimaginable now, right? Especially in these in times such as this, right? So you can imagine how beautiful it is, and it is the world that is constructed, right? And it is and it also, Malgudi also changes, just like the character changes, right? And it grows, it changes, it reacts, right? And that is the reaction that is required, all right, of us when we grow up, when we read children's literature, all right? The kind of sublimity, the kind of how the mind is molded, or how the mind develops because of reading such novels that create a fantastical world for us, but instill in us the sense of belonging, right? And my most favorite writer, J.K. Rowling, right? Harry Potter series, all right? J.K. Rowling creates a world that perhaps is a mixture of more of magic and, almost of action, right? And yes, she creates Azkaban, right? In the book that is prescribed for you, Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, right? Azkaban, for example, she creates a place. We know the characters, we know everybody, but the place Azkaban is a horrendous place, a prison. All right, and look at the fantasy that revolves around a prison. A prison is a place that we never think about. We do not want to think about, right? And we think about a place that is full of people who are evil, right? And look at the imprisoned, Death Eaters who are imprisoned. All right, who are they? How are they guarded? How are they protected? All right, or how are they, looked after? They are in the presence of Dementors, right? And where is Azkaban? It is perhaps in a remote island. It is virtually, you cannot get out of that. All right, like Lupin says, it is a fortress. All right, but there is no need to, build walls or have any security. Why? Because the people who are there are sucked out of life. Right, are sucked out of their cheerfulness or their joy, all right? And why? Because of these Dementors, right? And the interesting part of Azkaban, or the story of Azkaban, the novel that you are doing, is that Sirius Black is the person who escapes from that. And, that causes so much of anxiety, that causes so much of ruckus, that it comes in the newspapers, right? If you remember the newspaper of the magical world, right? And they all talk about it, right? How Sirius Black has escaped, all right? The Death Eater has escaped. So that becomes such a big thing. And another interesting fact, another interesting fantasy created by J.K. Rowling. This is something that we see every day. And this is basically based on the British, the buses that run in London, right? The double-decker buses. But here, the night bus, right? The night service bus for stranded wizards and witches, right? Which Harry Potter inadvertently calls for in this book, right? And it's a triple-decker. Look at the color of the bus. It's purple, right? And it is public transportation. Right? Who would have thought that wizards wanted public transportation? I mean, they have the flu powder, they have apparition, right? They can appear anywhere they want. But look at this, they have public transport, right? And the way it moves, the way it collapses, the way it expands to suit the necessity of the time, right? Whether there are many wizards there, people who are sleeping inside the bus, for example, right? And becomes a mode of transportation, a safe mode of transportation for Harry Potter. Now, the most interesting creature that J.K. Rowling creates is Dementors, the dark creatures of Azkaban, right? And that you cannot describe. And we see these creatures always in other books as well. And these are things that consume human, happiness, the cheer that is in us, the joy that is in us. All right. Think of the things that, withdraw, take away joy from you, right? Think of all that. Maybe you can connect it to Dementor, all right? So what do? They create darkness, they create misery, they create despair, right? But, there's an easy way out, chocolate, right? And what is the role in the book, in The Prisoner of Azkaban? They are the jailers, all right? And they are also the executioners, right? When the Wizarding Council decides that this person has to be executed, right? He sucks the life out of the Death Eater, or the person imprisoned. Another interesting creature, fantastical creatures. Now, creatures is something that are very important in fantasy, right? The Grimm, right? The large black dog, right? Black, again, like Sirius is known as Padfoot, right? Sirius Black, again, black associated. It's a ghostly black dog figure, right? Black's transformed perhaps into, that's his transfiguration, right? He becomes like the Grimm. This is how perhaps the Grimm looks like, right? So it is and the Grimm is always a symbol, or something that tells you something is going to go wrong, that death is coming, all right? Something that is prophecies, perhaps something that is going to be bad, right? And there are several other interesting little fantastical creatures created by J.K. Rowling, right? Her books are so full of creatures that are so interesting, and Bogarts are one of them, right? And you see them here in this book as well, right? And what are these creatures? They love to hide in dark and close places, right? And they always take up the reflection, or they become what you fear the most, right? They become the apparition that you fear the most, right? For example, for Harry Potter, it takes on the shape of a Dementor because he's scared of Dementors, right? So, and the easy way to, perhaps defend yourself from this is to think of comedy, to think of something that brought so much of joy to your life, to think of ideas that brought so much of joy, or the person or some situation, and just say ridiculous, and the Bogart, doesn't frighten you anymore, right? So connected to our life again, right? How many difficult situations we faced, right? And how do we look at life, right? All you have to do is face it with a pleasant smile, perhaps, right? The other creatures, werewolves and hippogriffs, right? Werewolves, Lupin, for example, right, becomes a human being infected because of a bite, right? Becomes a werewolf only on a full moon night, and they become uncontrollable, they become fearsome, all right? And they can kill people. And though there is, there is some sort of medicine that keeps them calmed down, there is no, absolute cure for this, right? Hippogriffs are introduced to us by Hagrid, right? The magical beast that has, that looks like half an horse and has wings and looks like an eagle, right? And it's so proud, right? A very proud creature that, becomes the vehicle of transportation, becomes a vehicle of, opening up avenues for Harry Potter. So look at the fantasy, the world of fantasy created by these writers. And this, I can, assuredly tell you, this can happen only in children's literature, right? Because fantasy is something that a child's imagination can absorb. A child, the child in us, in all of us, can understand, can, fully coordinate with the author and with the protagonist and understand what real life is through fantasy. All right. So why fantasy? Why do you have children literature? fantasy in children's literature, basically because for a child, there are no boundaries, right? For a child's imagination, there are no boundaries, right? If you remember your childhood, people told you not to do this more than they told you to do this, right? The do nots are more than the do's, right? So there are no boundaries. We try to explore, right? And writers are also able to convey complex ideas, right, in a very symbolic way. For example, C.S. Lewis's the Narnia series, the Chronicles of Narnia, right? It's a very simple story, but very symbolic, right? And how to about what life is all about, right? And what what the biblical stories are, right? Fantasy gives us a very different, very fresh look on what the real life, and it can also give us universal truths through magic and supernatural that is used. Right? That's why you have one of the critics writing, right? Fantasy is true, of course. It isn't factual. There are no facts. You cannot prove that this is true, but it is true because you believe it is true, right? What is needed to understand a literature of fantasy, a fantasy that makes a child's imagination widen, is that you have to just believe what you see, right? And it is a way of understanding existence, right? It is realistic. It is real at certain points, right? It is fantasy at certain points is as real as our real life. That is why Thomas Hardy, one of the greatest novelists in English literature, right, preferred fantasy. He says it is a story must be exceptional enough to justify its telling. I should tell a story, but I should, that story should be so beautiful that I have to tell it. Like Maya Angelou says, the story is within me, and my bones wax old. If I cannot narrate the story, right? It is the ordinary experiences of any person, all right, any human being, but narrated for a child to understand, right? So in conclusion, I would like to say fantasy offers so much for young readers, right? Be it in a metaphorical way, be it in an allegorical way. It could be a parable, right? But fantasy, the literature of fantasy, all right, the children's literature using the fantasy, all right, talks about social reality. It brings in social reality. How do we do it? If you look at Harry Potter, if you look at Malgudi Days, Swami and Friends, right? You can look into the education system, right? You can talk about how children, need so much of care, right? You can talk about how it is a journey to understand oneself. All right, Harry Potter grows up to be a child. The novels talk about how this child grows up to be a person who understands life, right? So he is dealing with very moral, very complex questions, but in a very playful, very enjoyable manner, right? But of course, in an exaggerated manner. Of course, we all love exaggerations, right? And it also allows you to see the world in different ways, right? And we can construct meaning. We can construct what happens, unrelated concepts of things, right? We can understand what life is because we don't know what the future is, but we can, like Hans Andersen says, right? We can always hope for something better. We can always see that there is hope in adversity, right? Like in times such as this, for example, right? So fantasy is the world into which a child can actually grow into, right? And children's literature, as I said, basically has a lot of fantasy literature and has so much of interesting things that can be discussed and can be read. There is so much of scope for research and understanding. All right, so I would conclude with these ideas. I hope you found it interesting enough. All right, because it's just me sharing a few things based on your syllabus, right? Because I thought it'll be wonderful if you could go through the fantastical elements of literature that you're reading, because your paper is so fantastical as it is. It's so full of fantasy. All right, and I hope you're enjoying children's literature as much as all of us enjoy reading, right? Thank you so much for the opportunity. I hope that that I haven't rushed through my presentation. I usually have this tendency to talk a lot. I restricted myself not to do so. Right? There are questions being posted. Can I?
Yes, ma'am. Can I help you reading out the questions?
Yeah. Yes.
Are scientific or fairy tales useful for raising a child? People are inclined to write off fantasy as escapism. Is this statement true?
Yes, people use fantasy as escapism. Just give me a minute, 1 minute, right? Right. Fantasy as an escapist way, yes, right? Definitely, we can see that. But is it always a route for escape? No, right? Because if you look at Harry Potter, for example, if I give you an example from Harry Potter itself, he has to come back to his aunt and uncle to live, right? This is the reality. If you look at Hermione, right? Her parents are dentists, right? She knows she has to come into the mother's world, right? So, we cannot just write fantasy off as escapism. If you look at the structures, right? If you look at the issues that are discussed in these stories, you'll understand that fantasy is just perhaps a mere curtain, right? Or a mere stage on which we perform. We discuss what needs to be discussed, issues that are there. Right. The question also had, can children be raised with these books? Yes, you can teach them. A child can be taught to read, to learn, right, to understand a lot of things based on the books that are written, the picture books that are written, morals, for example. I mean, we would have read Jataka tales. We would have had stories, Aesop's fables, being part of moral science books for us, right? These are stories that are narrated, right, for children. I hope that that answered your question.
Yeah.
Next
Ma'am, then our next question. Thank you, ma'am. Any habit becomes an addiction. Some children immensely read a lot when they are overfed with fantasies. How to make them face reality?
All right, that's a good question. It is interesting to note that people are reading, right? Reading itself has become a second, it has become something people have started avoiding, right? It is more into watching, right? It is more presentation nowadays. Yes, addiction, whether it is reading, addiction of any sort is bad, right? That is why we learn how to balance things in literature, right? That's a there is always punishment if you don't do homework, right? In Harry Potter, right? Detentions are there, right? Or the father in Swami and Friends takes up the punishment, gives punishment for Swami when he refuses to study. He has to get up in the morning to study, right? So it is, we can fail. There are realities that are presented there, but using fantasy. And are we being overfed with fantasy? I think we can regulate that. That is very simple, right? All you have to do is to read all genres, right? Don't just fix yourself just to fantasy, read all genres, right? You can read Charles Dickens, Nicholas Nickleby, again talking about education, or Oliver Twist, right? So read all genres. What is your opinion on the use of humorous literature to improve children's reading engagement? It is a fantastic way. For example, if you look at the limericks that are used, if you look at Lewis Carroll, the way that he uses words, the language that he uses, how he trips over words, right? If you, for example, I gave you the first poem that I read, right? This person has such beautiful poems. You should actually browse through or perhaps read some of his poetry. It's so interesting because the children learn how to pronounce. It's like reading Tennyson's Brook, right? Repetitive words, or Wordsworth, I wandered lonely as a cloud, right? So these are things that when you repeat, your language also improves, right? And the child also gets engaged in reading.
Yeah.
I
And the
hope
next one, ma'am, why are there more fantasy in children's literature than others?
I would say because a child is more imaginative, right? One reason. And looking at the writer's point of view, it is more easy. It is very difficult to convince a child that such a world exists, because a child has more questions than an adult, right? So therefore, and a child will imagine, but comes back to reality, right? An adult is a person who will stay sometimes in fantasy, whereas a child knows the difference, right? And perhaps it is also the authors who think that children love fantasy, right? And want to read fantasy, because no child writes it. Let's understand basically one fact, that no child writes, very few children writers are there, but mostly it is adults writing for children. So obviously there's going to be fantasy, but it's enjoyable to read.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question, are children basically different thinkers and believers of fantasy than adults?
All right. Yes, children do think differently. All right.
And the second part you have?
Yeah. Why are children and fantasy linked? Marvelous. Again, because children can easily believe, right? The willing willing suspension of disbelief, right, is easier for a child than for adults, right? And therefore, we can give real life situations in a very beautiful way, right? And the child will accept it and understand the moral in it, right? And the next question is, will children's literature enable for critical thinking and boosting our imaginative power? Yes, yes, it does. Because if you take Alice in Wonderland, for example, Alice has to come up with ways of finding out, going through, how does she interact with people? And she doesn't understand some of the things because the language, the way they speak, for example, if you want to approach something, you have to walk backward, right? So these are things that improve the way that Alice starts thinking, looking at things. So obviously, it is very important for critical thinking, right? And a child exposed to such literature will definitely be more imaginative, because your mind is already young. It is imaginative. It is creative. And when you see that there are so many avenues, you can imagine a world itself. I mean, what else is there, right?
Thank you, ma'am. The next question. What is the role and importance of wizards in children's fantasy literature?
Wizards.
Yeah.
Magic is very important in fantasy, especially in children's literature. Most of the stories, Enid Blyton, if you take up, right? Though she writes about 5 Findouters and 7 Secret 7 and whatever, right? You still have the fantasy world that she creates, right? The faraway woods, the faraway tree, right? And the flying wishing chair and all that. So you have to have magic, and without magic, there is no children's literature. Does magic exist or not? that is up to your imagination, right? Is it a sleight of hand? It is up to your imagination, right? So yes, you do need wizards, right? It doesn't have to be the dark wizards. It does. We are not talking about something that is very dark, right? This is magic that makes people happy, basically, right?
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. What are the best topics for a thesis on a fantasy novel? Any?
Best topic, usually, what we actually look for is the archetypes, right? We look at the travel, the idea of traveling, the idea of journey, right? One of the interesting things about fantasy literature mostly is you look at children who face situations alone, right? Some of them are orphans. For example, Harry Potter is an orphan, right? If you look at some of the most interesting characters created, most of them are orphans, right? And they have to find their way out of their way into life, all right, or into society. Heidi, for example, is an orphan, right? They have to create a world for themselves, right? So it is. And you can also look at how the world is created and there are so many significances of the historical aspects of it, right? There are so many research topics that actually there was one person who's actually researching on the circus stories, right? The circus and how in India also we have circuses. Any folklore, any village has somebody who comes and performs, and we call them the circus, right? What happened to our circuses nowadays, and what are the stories related? There's an entire team that is working on this particular idea, right? And they are actually looking for books from India, right? And it's interesting, a simple thing like circus, right, is very interesting research topic, right? So there are so much to research on. There is so much actually to research.
Thank you, ma'am. There's another question about the themes in children's literature. The tragic and inevitable loss of childhood. Innocence is one of the main themes of Alice in Wonderland. Why are such heavy themes dealt in many children's novels?
All right. Basically, because most of the books or the fiction literature that was written for children was basically not written for children. It was meant for adults. But since the character was a child, or it appealed more to the child, right? It became children's literature. So the classification of Alice in Wonderland, for example, there were stories that were told to children, but was basically written for the adult reading world, right? But we have transformed it to be children's literature because Alice is a child. The protagonist is a child. So that is one reason why it is so heavy, right? That is one reason why you have so much of heaviness in themes, right? Themes that deal with life, right? But I think the children also understand and are able to grasp what life is all about through reading these novels.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. What is the significance of fantasy in literature? Does it influence or teach the reader?
All books influence, all books teach, everything teaches us, right? You can learn so much from everything, be it a book, be it a situation in life, be it a person in front of you, right? There is so much to learn from everything that is around you. What is the significance of fantasy in literature? Literature is, does not hold the mirror to society as we claim it. It also holds the mirror to our mind. What does the mind think? How does a human mind think? All right. The mind is something that is so rich with imagination. All right. And look at the minds look at C.S. Lewis, how he thinks about a simple story that is narrated in the Bible, right? How he brings up an entire series calling it the Chronicles of Narnia, right? So, making simple things right? Simple stories into fantastic, that requires imagination, just like how Milton required imagination to write Paradise Lost. It is just a simple, very simple story, right? But it took up the epic, the epic nature, the genre, right? So does it influence? Yes, it does influence, right? And does it teach? Yes, it does teach, right? But good or bad, I think if we have, if we learn what is good, how to differentiate between the good and bad from reading and from listening, I think that will be the way that we can allow it to influence and teach us.
Thank you, ma'am. What books would you suggest for the beginners in children's literature?
All right. Beginners, of course, Aesop's Fables, Jataka Tales, right? If you want to read in British literature, Enid Blyton will be fantastic to read, right? There are so many, she has so many stories, Noddy, that is depending on the age group, right? Because, I mean, I enjoy reading Noddy, but depending on the age group, you can give them a lot of stories, right? There are so many books that are available. There are lists actually available that you can find out. And most of the books are available free on the internet, right? So there are a lot of books.
Thank you, ma'am. And there's one more question. How reading differs from watching a fantasy novel transformed to a movie?
All right. I'm a person who loves reading more than watching a movie. In fact, when Harry Potter, the movie came in first, I really didn't want to watch the movie because the basic difference is the book has more story to it than a movie. See, a director or a script writer has to think about the time frame that he has, right? He has about 1.5 hours or 2 hours to present the story, which means he cannot present everything that is there in the book, the nuances, the emotions, the people, right? And the imagination of the reader, how Harry Potter would have looked, how Hermione would have looked, all right? All this is something, or how the Wonderland would have looked. All right, these are things that we can imagine, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the way, from person to person it changes. But when a movie comes in, all right, it is clear cut. Now, if you think of Harry Potter, you only think about the person who acted as David Radcliffe, right? Who acted as Harry Potter, and every time you look at him, the only idea or the only image that comes to your mind is that he is Harry Potter. Right, you don't. It's difficult to accept him in any other role, be it in movies or in any web series as well. Right, so I would personally prefer reading more than movies, but of course, visual impact is greater. Right, more than reading, visual impact is greater, and children understand by seeing more than by just reading. Right, so it is very important.
Thank you, ma'am. Is it fine for children to read dark fantasy tales like the Red Stone Shoes, and the other stories written by Hans Christian Andersen? Wouldn't it create a negative impact?
It depends on the age of the person, right, and how you're reading it. That is why I said modern literature has, classified children's literature age-based, right? And for example, would it influence in a negative way? No, if you're able to understand that it is just a story, right? And you can take good things from stories. You can take good things from everything that is around you, right? But don't absorb what is negative, right? You learn how to prepare yourself, right? So negativity or the dark thing is, and you cannot deny that it exists. It is there, right? So you should be aware. This creation of awareness is what is Anderson is focused on, right? That you should be aware of what is negative and stay away from it, right? That is where children's literature steps in, helping you to stay away from the negative that is present. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you so much for patiently answering the questions.
Fantasy is, fantasy is a necessary ingredient for living. It's a way of looking at life imaginatively. Your speech on the various themes and the worlds of fantasy in children's literature has really motivated us to show more interest in reading children's literature books. Thank you, ma'am, for your invigorating speech. Gratitude is the memory of the heart. Now I call upon Ms. Jaypriya Durga, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Shift 2, to propose the vote of thanks.
Give thanks to the Lord for His grace, which has been enriched in every way with all kinds of speech and knowledge. A pleasant evening to all. I deem it a great honor to render my sincere thanks to our resource person, Miss Elizabeth Thomas, Associate Professor, Department of English, Ethiraj College for Women, Chennai, for enlightening us with your captivating address. Ma'am, your source of information on origin, themes, characteristics, plots, and your bird's view on the entire syllabus by specifying the novels and areas of research are highly productive, which sets a perfect platform for our children in the genre of children's literature. Thank you, ma'am, for sharing your expertise with us. We are immensely benefited by your presentation. Thank you, ma'am. I take this opportunity to express my sincere thanks to our Secretary, Reverend Dr. Sister Niranjana, for her constant support. With a grateful heart, I record my gratitude to our Principal, Reverend Dr. Sister Christina Bridget, for her incessant support and efforts towards achieving greater heights of excellence. Thank you, Sister. I express my deep sense of gratitude to our dynamic lead, Reverend Dr. Sister Judy Gomes, Head of the Department of English, for her incredible work and diligent guidance in planning out to make every event to be a remarkable one. Thank you, dear sister, for your constant care which channel the staff and students to reach our perfection. Thank you, sister. I record my sincere thanks to our vice principals for their guidance, and I am also grateful for the technical assistance of Holy Cross College for helping us in streaming. I extend my thanks to the staff members of the department for their encouraging presence. I thank all the student in charges, representatives, and participants for your active participation. I am sure this session has fruitful and fulfilled the thirst of all the anticipated minds. Once again, I thank you all for your illustrious presence. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you,
Thank
ma'am.
you, ma'am, for your kind words of gratitude. Gratitude is not only the greatest of all the virtues, but also the mother of all the others. Now I thank each and every participant for your kind cooperation and valuable presence in making this webinar a grand success. Believe in yourself and control your own destiny in life. Time is the coin of your life, and only you can determine how it will be spent. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks to all the participants. Thank you for your patient hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Welcome. Ma'am. Thank you for being such a wonderful presenter. Master.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.